Hello again. Welcome to another lecture in our series dealing with the early history of Mahayana, particularly as it is expressed in the text of the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom literature. Our topic today is merit. And it's a topic which in the religions of the world has caused a lot of trouble, issues, debate, and certainly in Buddhism, a number of different theories, different approaches have been put forward. From the earliest days of the tradition, it did not yet invented by the Prajnaparamita text. It was firmly an issue long before they were redacted. And the issue about merit is, how do you make it? How do you use it? Can it be stored? Can it be transferred? Is it like money? Do I have a bank account of my merits? Can I deduct from them? Can I add to them? These are all issues. We can't discuss them all in the course of one lecture, but I hope that you will have a chance to do some research on your own and to deal with this very important issue, because this is one of the major practices, particularly in Chinese and East Asian Buddhism, but particularly for the Chinese. Transfer of merit becomes one of the most crucial points in terms of filial activity and your ancestral heritage. So Buddhism has been deeply involved with merit at a cultural as well as a religious and a personal level. We have the first glimmers of this coming from the story about Shakyamuni sitting under the Bodhi tree when he achieved the status of a Buddha. And the story goes, of course, as many of you are well aware, that once he had achieved his high state of what's called nirvana while still being alive, it was blissful. And he just sat in his bliss. The gods looked at this blissful ascetic under the Bodhi tree and in essence said, oh no, he's enjoying his bliss. He may never teach. It may be sufficient for him just to sit in his own bliss. But then they said, the world needs to hear what he's experienced. So Brahma comes to him in his blissful trance and says, please teach us. Please don't just go into your bliss. Now we have a very strange English word here. Supera supererogatory. It means to do something which is far beyond any requirement that you have. This is what heroes do. Heroes risk their life. They do extraordinary things far beyond any requirement of duty. And so at that moment, basically, what Brahma is saying to Shakyamuni is, yes, you could just stay there in your bliss. You've earned it. You've been working toward this through many lifetimes. It's been a long process. But people need to hear you. Now, of course, mystics and people who have extraordinary experiences always hesitate to try to tell people about it. How can you describe to somebody something which they themselves have never experienced? How can you tell somebody what a strawberry tastes like if they've never tasted one? Words just don't do it. And I think that's why many of the mystics and others hesitated to speak. And some mystics stopped speaking and just exist in their state. But the Buddha began to teach. And some people say this is the first example in Buddhism of the transfer of merit. The people who hear the Buddha teach didn't reach the stage which he's in. They are not his equal. He is not saying something to them which they all say, oh yes, I've had that too. So what we have in this is that the Buddha is going far beyond anything which he really has to do for his own enlightenment. And he transfers in the sense that he gives people something in his teaching which they would never have otherwise. And so because he taught, Buddhism exists today. In that sense, you can say that Buddhism is the merit of the Buddha given to us, directed toward us through his words, his remembered words. And so even in this sense, from very early beginnings of the tradition, there was some idea of passing along the meritorious activity or the meritorious gains that had been made. Now, as Indra and the others knew, nobody, in the Buddhist sense, none of us exist just with the present life. Instead, we have a heritage, and the Buddha had a heritage. He had many previous lives, and all the activity of all those lives culminated on the night of his enlightenment. For it was through those lifetimes of activity that the Buddhists believe he achieved his high state, his abilities. So in one sense, what we have in the idea of merit is a large community. And the community is all the people who've lived in the past, all the people living in the past whose actions, whose merits, whose demerits have come down to us. We're not just born as a one-time, never before seen type. We are born into a community. We are born into the whole of humanity. We are born, in fact, into a cosmic realm. And so the Buddha belonged and had behind him this enormous community. And it was this community that had helped him achieve what he achieved. So he had enormous amount of merit, if you will. And when he achieved the final nirvana, the question was, would he share it? And if he shared it, how would he do it? And what would he say? So in the Prajnaparamita text, it says, first example of getting merit, it's stated in the oldest Prajnaparamita text. Moreover, O Kaushika, if gentle sons and daughters were to study and recite Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom, for the sake of other people, they would not compare to gentle sons and daughters who themselves explain the meaning of it for other people. These latter ones, merit would be even greater. So, in other words, from the very beginning of the Prajnaparamita literature, it's saying, just reciting Prajnaparamita, studying it, it makes you get merit. But really, the thing which makes merit is that you not only recite the words of the Prajnaparamita, but you explain the meaning of it to other people. And that's what the Buddha did in the view of the Buddhist. He explained the meaning of his experience, and therefore he was not only acquiring merit, which he didn't really need, but he was helping and giving support to all the people around him by explaining the meaning of what had happened to him. He was teaching. The text goes on to say, a bodhisattva has a lot of merit. So suppose you took all the bodhisattvas that have ever existed and you combine them together and you add together all the merit that they have acquired. And the merit they have acquired because they have planted their wholesome roots with the Buddhas in the past, which is just a figurative way of saying the bodhisattvas lived, met, heard the Buddhas of the past. They had former lives. And in their former lives, there were the Buddhas. Now, this is an agricultural metaphor to plant good roots. And in Asia, it comes from the rice culture. Those of you who don't know about rice culture, you plant seeds in a bed, you pull them up, as you see here, and then you do this back-breaking labor, which is to take those roots one by one and plant them in the soil so that a new plant will be able to grow. I grew up on a farm. We did this with cabbage. We planted seeds in a little bed, and then we had to pull up the roots out of that bed, tie them up in little things just like you see here, and do the backbreaking labor of, on a day when it rained and the soil was wet, to go with a stick and stick it in the ground and take a good root and put it there and plant. So the Buddhists use this metaphor to talk about what it is, where it is, and what has happened to us. We are, in a sense, we have planted our roots in where we are right now. And so the question is, have we planted our roots in the right way? Now, in the drier climates, you don't have roots, you have seeds. People plant seeds. But in the rice cultures, they plant roots. And this is, where do you live? How do you gain the right environment to thrive and to survive? And it means you must find a way to plant your good roots. But then the Mahayana Prajnaparamita said, it's not only the merit that came from the Buddha who lived lifetime after a lifetime by having planted good roots in the right way, which thrived and produced merit, but all those who became his disciples also had a similar career in the past. They too had wholesome roots. They had planted. They had been with Buddhas in the past. In many cases, they would say, well, of course, they were disciples of the Buddha in his past life. They had planted their roots with him. They had lived with him. So to say plant wholesome roots just means figuratively to live. How did you live? Who did you live with? Where did you live? And the agricultural metaphors are a way of being able to explain this to people. How does merit occur? How does it thrive? How does it get passed along? Now, in the iconic art of Buddhism, we have single images of a meditating Buddha. It's not a narrative. It doesn't tell us when or where. It doesn't tell us anything other than it represents the aspect of the Buddha in his enlightenment and in his meditative state. And so people would go and look at these images, put plants of flowers in front of them, incense, offerings of water. All of these things were done in front of these images. People would visualize. They would sit there and their eye would go from the head to the feet and back to the head until finally they could visualize this image and hold it in their thought, close their eyes, and just be at one with the Buddha in this state. Buddhism is in many ways a religion of intention. Our actions have the intention of doing good and bringing merit. And so the Buddha who is meditating not only is doing it for himself, but because he can be observed, the merit of what he is doing, because he is being looked at and taken into the thoughts and ideas of all the people who view him, that idea becomes one in which even the silent merit being produced by a Buddha in a meditative state as an image can transfer or give us a great deal of help in terms of our own intentions. By taking this into our thoughts, we are led to have the intention of doing the same thing that we see the image representing. Then the Prajnaparamita texts do something which is really remarkable. They take the issue out of just this world, this earthly existence, and they put it into an idea that there are immeasurable, uncounted universes, and that in those uncounted universes that exist out there, there are Buddhas who are in nirvana. Now, it has always amazed me that the Buddhists had this idea. Where did they get the idea that the universe is this big, multiple, endless? They couldn't see it in the starry sky. You can look at the lights up in the sky, and you can even look at the lights scattered across the cosmos, our universe, back to almost a moment of the so-called Big Bang or the Big Expansion. And sometimes the dots don't tell us just how complex, and the fact that there are galaxies in those bright spots, billions of stars. So the existence of merit is seen to be cosmic in the Prajnaparamita. It's everywhere. And it expands. And the community that we live in, it becomes cosmic. We exist in a cosmic community with all of these other universes. And so the final thing is that the practice leads to the moment when we have many images of the Buddha shown at his death. We see the people around him weeping, moaning. But you always see in all of these one figure sitting quietly in front of the Buddha. And down in that corner where the figure of a monk is seen quietly sitting there is to say, this is not a moment for despair. This is not a moment for sorrow. This is the moment of parinirvana. This is the moment when the Buddha achieved in this world the highest state that a Buddha can achieve. And so the one who sits and looks at it is really receiving the merit that's being generated by this image of the Buddha achieving the highest state that he possibly can achieve. And that affects and creates the merit that others will aspire to and attempt. Now, this whole development of merit and how it gets created and what happens to it was seen and reported on by a Westerner. And that report tells us a great deal about how people have dealt with the idea of merit. Xavier, a Catholic priest, arrives in Japan. When he arrives there, he begins to teach. He is allowed to teach. He is a Catholic. The things that he teaches about merit and about the transfer of merit belong to a very developed and long-standing tradition about merit that existed in the West. But to his utter dismay, when he asked people about their beliefs about merit, he was stunned to find out that they were saying to him in his day, the 15th century, they were saying to him, it's impossible today to use meditation or to achieve a state through your own activity which can overcome the problems of this world and yourself. It just doesn't work anymore. It may have been true during the time of the Buddha. The Buddha's merit and the state of the world at that time meant that your meritorious deeds, your meditation, could lead you to salvation, if you will, full perfect enlightenment, nirvana. But the Japanese were saying, we don't live in such time. We live in a world which has moved so far from the teachings of the Buddha that we hardly understand them anymore. And so we can't use our works, our activities to achieve enlightenment. Well, this stunned Xavier because in Europe, Xavier represented one side of the big fight over merit and how to achieve it. In Europe, at his time, at death, everybody went to purgatory, a kind of in-between dark place, not very pleasant. And you had to stay in purgatory until you could have enough merit or could be aided so that you could move up to heaven and be with Christ. And so people were down in purgatory, and they wanted to get to heaven. And how can you help them? Well, for centuries, the way to help people move from purgatory to heaven in the West was that when someone died, you went to a monastery and you asked the monks, and particularly monks in this tradition, to pray and to transfer their good merit, because they were monks, to that dead person who was in purgatory, and thereby help them get into heaven. And that was the way you got your relatives into heaven, was to go to a monastery and ask the monastics to help you do it. Is it any wonder that there was a great period in Europe where monasteries proliferated and were everywhere? And they were badly needed because people needed them to help them get their dead into heaven. And then a change happened in Europe. The Crusades started. The Crusades were this attempt with armed forces to conquer the Holy Land and make it Christian, so that the homeland of Christianity would become Christian. And how do you get people to join these crusades? One of the ways was to promise them that if they went on the crusade, the bishop would give them the merit so that if they were killed, for example, they would go to heaven. So the idea grew up that even the people back at home, if you wanted to help your loved one into heaven, what you had to do is to go to the bishop, and you got what was called an indulgence. And in order to get the indulgence, this piece of paper even, that would allow your loved one to be ritually taken from purgatory to heaven, you had to confess your sins and repent of all your sins. And then they asked for one other thing, and this became so crucial in the way in which our culture has developed. The one thing you had to do was to help someone who was poor and needy, and that would activate the indulgence, which would move your loved one from purgatory to heaven without the use of the monastery. And that was probably a time where we can begin to see the demise of monasticism in Europe, which continues to the present day. The very reason for many of the monasteries had now been taken over by this lay ritual activity of getting your dead into heaven. But then came Martin Luther. And Martin Luther said, no, this is all wrong. You can't just use your good works. You can't just say, I'll get an indulgence. You can't just say, I'll give to the poor and the needy. And through my good works, I'll get my loved one into heaven. Luther said you only get into heaven through faith, not through works, faith. So when Xavier went to Japan and ran into Buddhism, and he was one who was part of the Catholic tradition where works was actually still something you could do, he found that he sent back a note to the Vatican and said, this terrible teaching of Luther has somehow already found its way into Japan, and they are rejecting the teachings of the church. Well, the teachings of Luther had not gotten to Japan, as far as we know. And the tradition in Buddhism, similar to Christianity, was that there is this moment where the transfer of merit is questioned. Can I do something to make it happen? Or do I just have to rely on faith? For the Japanese Buddhism, there is no question but what most of them said. The largest number of Japanese have always said, you must rely upon Amitabha and his vow to save and to take you into his pure land and to ultimately lead you to enlightenment. You don't have the merit, you don't have the ability anymore to do that any other way. So in both East and West, it's very interesting that this transfer of merit became such an issue. Can you do it through your own effort? The Japanese said, no, you cannot do it by your own effort. You must do it through reciting and giving your faith to Amitabha. And Martin Luther was saying, I don't care how many monasteries, how much monasticism, how much practice of asceticism. You can't do it through your works. You just have to have the gift of faith. So it's been a worldwide issue. It's still with us. And the reason we know it's still with us is that when people said, now, if I'm trying to get my loved one into heaven in the West, I've got to help the poor and needy. But I don't know how to do that. Where is somebody who's poor and needy? And so they formed clubs that had programs to help the poor and needy. They were called confraternities. And these confraternities, you didn't have to worry about it. You just went to the confraternity and you gave them money, and they gave it to the poor and needy. And those confraternities are still with us. The Lions Club, the Kiwanis, Knights of Columbus. That's where they all come from. That's their roots. And what makes a person good, a good person in the West, is somebody who helps the poor and needy. That's how we define ourselves as good. So all of these things have become very important in the cultural history of both Europe and Asia. Now, in the Prajnaparamita, it says, the Bodhisattvas rejoice in this merit of enlightenment, which is the greatest, the supreme, the highest, the most sublime, and have it rejoiced in it, they, and here I've used the translation, redirect it to full perfect enlightenment, anuttara samyak sambodhi. I don't use the word transfer. That's because in the Buddhist tradition, coming from India, your karma must bear fruit. If you do something, you have to get the result of it, no matter what. Eventually, you get the result of your action. And there's no way to avoid it. But with the transfer of merit, there came the idea that people could give you their merit. You could get a special dispensation, and you could have a transfer of this, somebody else's goodness transferred over to yourself. But when you read in the Prajnaparamita, what is interesting to me is that the transfer of merit is not done to your family, not done to the dead, not done to somebody who needs help. It means, that's why I translated it redirect, that when you have this merit, what do you do with it? You use it to achieve enlightenment. You use it on yourself. You redirect it. We need to reach our own state of enlightenment. So I'm not sure. There are people in Japan who have said the very idea of transfer of merit is anti-Buddhist. And they've shocked Japan by saying, we need to stop it. We need to stop thinking that you can transfer merit to the dead. And they could point to early Mahayana texts in a way to support their arguments. So the big issue is the dead. And the dead are a problem in every culture. If you have a culture in which the dead are very much like us living, they're just in another realm. They're just next door. They get hungry. They get cold. They're pitiful. They need to be cared for. They do not transform that much at death. Then those cultures that have that idea of the dead can become really dangerous. Because if they're not taken care of, they become hungry ghosts. And a hungry ghost is one who has a huge belly and a tiny throat that only 1 grain of rice can get down. They can never get enough to eat. The hungry ghosts then are bitter and angry and destructive. So in China, there grew up the idea that one of the Buddha's disciples, Mahayana, Mu Lian in Chinese, had very great magical power. And he meditated, and with his magical power, he said, I'm going to go look for my mother. And when I find her, I'll help her. And so he went looking magically for his mother, and he found her. And he found out she was a hungry ghost. She was basically in a lower realm. And he came out of his trance state in which he had been looking for his mother and found his father. And he said, I'm so upset because I found mother, but she was in a terrible state. And in the one story, the father says, well, son, I'm really sorry to tell you, but your mother was not such a good person after all. She was, in fact, one who had acquired bad karma, and now she suffers. So, but Mahayana Mulian said, I must go help her. And so he took food and he went back in his trance and he put it in front of her, and she grabbed the food and stuck it into her mouth, where it turned into a fiery hot coal that burned her, and she had to spit it out. She couldn't eat it. It's like the story of King Midas, who said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. Well, be careful, because that means everything you put in your mouth turns to gold and you can't eat it. So Mahayana goes back to the Buddha and he says, what can I do? I want to help my mother. I want to give her help. But when I take food to her, she can't eat it. So the Buddha said there's only one way that you can feed your dead. And that is, after the rainy season, the monks and nuns have been in retreat for 3 months, meditating. And they have a lot of good merit at that moment. So when they come out of the retreat, take them a banquet. Best food you can find. And when those monks see the food, they will bless it and make it available for the hungry ghosts. And your mother will be fed. This was an extremely powerful message about merit in China, that the Buddhists had the ability to feed the dead when otherwise they would not be able to eat, was an enormous statement of power. And so the Ulambana festival, which is, we're just coming out of the period when they celebrate this, is at harvest time, is an example of how merit is transferred to the dead through food. And that food becomes the reality or a physical example of how merit can be transferred over to your dead ancestors. Now, the texts say, the Prajnaparamita says, this redirection of merit, you got to understand, in the Mahayana Prajnaparamita teaching, it's not connected with anything. And that to which it is redirected is also not connected with anything. If you can really direct your power and your merit without making it a physical thing that you are sending it, passing along to something, someone, some person, then what you're doing is not poisonous. But if you have the idea, my dead one is waiting there and I will give my mother this food, then that's the wrong way to do it. Now, of course, this is the Prajnaparamita, constantly reminding us there is no self-nature. There is no permanent, existing, continuing thing. Everything is momentary. And you got to keep that in mind, even when you're doing something as important as feeding your dead ancestors. Well, Thailand has this wonderful ceremony. If you go to a monastery and you help provide the meal for the monks, after the meal, you're given a container of water. And that water is the merit which you have acquired by giving the lunch to the monks. And you go outside to a bamboo grove and you meditate, and you, in a calm way, take the cup of water and start to pour it onto the ground where the bamboo roots are. And as you pour it, you recite, I transfer this merit, and then you name all of your relatives that you wish to have the merit, those dead relatives, your mother, your father, your grandparents. It's very nice. It's very meaningful. I did it shortly after my mother died. And I gave it all to her. And it was very moving to me to do that. Now, you might say, well, this is all well and good, Professor, but we don't feed our dead in the United States or in Europe or even in the great cities of Asia anymore, but certainly not in Los Angeles. What we do, we call it Halloween. What is Halloween? Halloween is as the cold weather comes on. We don't want the spirits to come into our house and live with us. They're dangerous. They're ghosts. How can we keep them out? We must feed them. We must give them food, which is to transfer merit to them. And so when those children come to our door and say, trick or treat, they mean we dead spirits will move in and give you a hard time, or you feed us and we'll go away. And so we have bags full of candy and we feed them. We, in a sense, say, go away. Don't come and live with me. Let me give you what you need. I'm going to transfer my merit in this sweet candy to you. And they take it, and the ghosts and the goblins and all the ones that come to our door depart and leave us alone. So today I've talked to you a lot about merit. How do you transfer it? Do you? Is it possible? How is it done? Is there a ritual way to do it? Is there some way in which we have to operate so that we can be able to acquire the merit How can we help our dead? Can merit be transferred to them? Can we make life better for them? These are issues which are worldwide. Certainly, we have the Day of the Dead in our Latino communities here in the US and to the south of the border for us. A wonderful holiday, one of their best. And the dead come, and you invite them, and you want them, and you have skeletons, and you want them to come in, and on that Day of the Dead, you sing and dance for them, you bring them joy. So when we look at what the Buddha did when he started to teach, he was transferring merit in a way. He was redirecting his merit to us through his teaching and giving us something which was so meaningful in terms of the teaching. But when you look at the transfer and the way in which we live our lives, all of these issues are still with us. We are still struggling with all of it. And so you can say we in the United States don't feed our dead, but the second largest holiday in the US after Christmas is Halloween. We try to give it to the children to do it for us, but it is so meaningful that it has become one of the few holidays which is recognized and practiced by everybody. Nobody is excluded from it. And we have, and I hope this year you can think about it if you do trick or treat, what it means to try to pass on to those who are hungry ghosts, those who are no longer with us, those who need support and help in order to survive in that other realm. It's very complicated, but it's one of the most fascinating topics, I think, that exists for us in Buddhist studies, as well as in religious studies, social studies, and even psychological issues of how we help our dead, our living, and perhaps most importantly, ourselves. Thank you very much.